Welcome to the deep dive. We take the sources you're interested in and pull out the key knowledge for you fast.
Exactly.
And you, our listener, you're curious about archaeological findings and how they sort of intersect with historical accounts, especially the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission today is to dig up some, surprising facts, maybe deliver a few aha moments, but without just drowning you in information.
Yeah, keep it focused. We've got some interesting sources, articles from the Institute for Creation Research, AWS, and also one from the Gospel Coalition called Why We Dig.
Good stuff. So let's dive in. We're starting way back, around 2300 BC, the Ibla tablets. Really remarkable discovery.
It really is. And what's kind of mind-blowing from the get-go is that these 17,000 tablets, they're probably just like a fraction of what was originally there.
Wow.
Yeah, think about it. This likely wasn't even the main royal archive. Maybe stuff for scribal training, temporary loans.
So there could be way more out there.
Potentially, yeah. If they ever find those central archives, I mean, the understanding we could gain. Enormous.
Just incredible. And it wasn't just like boring lists, was it?
Not at all. It's a real wealth of information. Personal names, for one thing. And get this, 260 geographic names in just one text.
260.
Yeah. Plus lists of animals, jobs, officials. It really brings Abla to life, you know?
Totally. And these historical texts, they actually connect with other records we know about.
Yeah.
Like from Marek.
Exactly. Which helps us piece together things like, well, how Ebla eventually got defeated by Nurim-Sin.
Right. And there's that idea, isn't there, about why they might have fallen.
Yeah, the conjecture, based on the text, is that maybe they relied too much on mercenaries instead of their own strong army.
Interesting. A strategic insight, really.
It really is. Shows how decisions back then, not just brute force, shaped history.
And the language aspect, that was huge too, right? This Paleo-Canaanite language.
Oh, absolutely revolutionary. Nobody knew about it before. And it turns out it's closely related to languages like Hebrew and Phoenician later on.
Like finding a whole lost branch on the language tree.
Pretty much. And the script itself is interesting. They used Sumerian cuneiform signs, but adapted them for the sounds of their local Akkadian language. It really shows how interconnected these cultures were, sharing and adapting writing.
So they didn't just invent their own script from scratch?
Nope. They adapted what was available, and finding those vocabulary lists, basically Sumerian and dictionaries, that was the absolute key.
The Rosetta Stone for Ebla, almost?
In a way, yeah. Without those, interpreting the tablets would have been, well, mostly guesswork.
But it wasn't just language and names. There was more, wasn't there? Laws,
Yeah.
stories.
Oh, yeah. Legal texts for sure, including what looks like the oldest law code ever found, older than Deuteronomy.
Wow.
And literary stuff, too. Myths, incantations, proverbs, hymns to gods we see later in Babylonian texts like Enki, Enlil, Utu, Inanna.
So a really complex society.
Definitely. You see economic stuff, lots of trade records, sure. But these legal and literary texts, they point to a sophisticated culture, well-defined laws, rich spiritual life.
And these ideas spread, right? You mentioned Mesopotamian scholars copying Syrian tablets.
That's established fact. They copied tablets from libraries in Syria, including Ebla. These ancient learning centers were definitely connected, sharing knowledge.
Okay, so let's pivot a bit. For you, listening, with that interest in the Bible, this is where it gets really interesting, right? The Old Testament connections.
They are quite remarkable, yeah. You see these striking similarities in personal names.
Like,
Well, names like Enanel, Edom Malik, Abdurasa'ap, Ishabu, lots of others. They have clear Hebrew parallels.
and finding them in similar forms suggests what?
It strongly suggests a shared cultural background, some kind of interdependence between these peoples way back then.
It's not just names either, is it? Actual words.
Right, like the word En in Ebla Sumerian for king, and then Malik in Paleo-Canaanite, also king. That's very close to the Hebrew Melech. Or Abu for elders in Eblek, which sounds a lot like Hebrew Abba for father. These aren't just coincidences, they point to common roots.
And there was that idea about names evolving, maybe reflecting a change in understanding God.
That's a thought-provoking possibility, yeah. Seeing a shift, maybe from Mikal to Micaiah. Could it show a move towards a more personal idea of God?
Like the Yah ending, referring to Yahweh.
Potentially. And you see names like Enani Yah, meaning Yah has mercy on me. Or even Rayan Dad. A dad is our shepherd. That echoes Psalm 23, doesn't it?
It really does. So a spiritual landscape was definitely there, perhaps developing.
Seems likely. And then there are the places. The Abla tablets mention cities that pop up later in the Old Testament, but in records from the 3rd millennium BC.
Like which ones?
Salim, maybe Melchizedek City, Hazor, Lachish, Megiddo, Gaza, even Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem.
So these places existed way back then.
The record suggests so. It anchors these biblical locations in a much earlier history, though interestingly, Salim and Jerusalem are listed separately back then.
Huh. Different places at that time.
Seems that way. And what about those cities of the plain? Sodom, Gomorrah.
They're in there too?
Yep. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Listed along the King's Highway from Damascus around 2300 BC. It's almost like finding the setting for Genesis 14.
That's pretty specific.
It is. Even Carchemish gets a mention. And Professor Patinato made that point about Isaiah knowing the ancient name of the god Chemosh suggests a long memory.
So beyond names and places, what about, like, cultural practices?
Well, the tablets hint at broader parallels, too. Possible echoes of the Genesis creation story, mentions of dealings with Hittites before Abraham, which, by the way, counters older skepticism about whether the Hittites even existed that early.
Right. Archaeology later proved they did.
Exactly. We also see treaty formats similar to Exodus, laws pointing towards justice concepts like in Exodus, even ritual sacrifices that seem to predate Leviticus and the Canaanites.
And prophets, or something like that.
References that could be interpreted that way, yeah. Before the Old Testament Nevi'im. But, and this is important, one of the sources really stresses this.
What's that?
That the Old Testament ultimately has a unique ethical, moral, and spiritual depth. These parallels are interesting contexts, but the Bible's message stands apart.
Okay, got it. So Abele provides this deep historical backdrop, and the takeaway seems to be archaeology doesn't disprove the Bible.
Well, as one source puts it, no discovery has conclusively disproven its accuracy. Which brings us nicely to the next phase, right?
Yeah, let's move forward a bit. To Abraham's time, maybe around 2000 BC.
Okay. Now, it's worth noting, that some scholars are still skeptical about whether figures like Abraham actually existed historically.
Despite the evidence we've been discussing.
Yeah, the skepticism persists in some circles. But let's look at what the archaeology does show for that period. Take Haran, where the Bible says Abraham came from.
What about it?
Archaeology confirms it was a major commercial hub around 2000 BC. Right when Abraham is traditionally placed.
Okay, that fits.
And then there's evidence it was sort of abandoned, or at least became much less important, between 1800 and 700 BC, which also fits the later biblical timeline. One source calls that correlation quite notable.
And the name Abraham itself?
Well, no, we don't have a letter signed sincerely Abraham, obviously.
Right.
But the name itself, Abraham, is found in other texts from the 19th, 18th centuries BC, the right time period. Names go in and out of fashion,
Like Jennifer or Jason in modern time.
Exactly. But beyond just the name Abraham, there's the type of names common in Genesis for the patriarchs.
What do you mean?
These Amorite imperfective names. They often start with a Y sound in Hebrew, like Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, rendered J or I in English sometimes.
Okay. And the significance.
These specific types of names, outside the Bible, they're mostly found in the early 2nd millennium BC and before, the patriarchal period.
So the names common in Genesis were common in that specific era.
That's what the evidence suggests. The statistical analysis in our sources shows the use of these names peaks around 1800 BC, then drops off significantly later.
When some critics think the stories were actually written down.
Precisely. So the fact that Genesis has such a high proportion of these names fits the supposed time of the patriarchs, statistically speaking, is quite compelling.
What about camels? I feel like I've heard arguments about camels in Genesis being wrong.
Ah, yes, the camel controversy. Some scholars did argue that domesticated camels were an anachronism for Abraham's time, said they weren't common until much later. But archaeology keeps turning things up. We now have texts from Alak, 18th century BC, mentioning camels. Old Babylonian lists include them. A Sumerian text mentions camel's milk.
Okay.
And actual camel bones found in contexts suggesting domestication, dating back as far as 2900 BC and definitely around 1800 BC. So the Genesis account seems to fit the emerging evidence now.
Fascinating how things change with new finds. What about money? Or, well, trade value?
Good question. Look at the price of slaves in the Bible. Joseph being sold for 20 shekels in Genesis.
Yeah.
That price fits archaeological records for slave prices around 2000 BC. Later, in Exodus, the price is 30 shekels that fits the time of Moses.
And even later.
During King Menahem's reign, 2 Kings mentions 50 shekels, which again matches prices known from that later period.
So the economic details seem historically grounded for their respective times.
It looks that way. It's another layer of detail that seems consistent.
Okay, let's shift to worship practices. You mentioned laws earlier. What about rituals?
Right. Take the Feast of Trumpets offerings detailed in numbers. Critics used to say, oh, that's late, maybe 600 BC. But a Hittite text turned up mid-2nd millennium BC, specifying the exact same sequence of offerings.
Seriously, the same order.
Exactly the same. Suggests those practices might be much older than previously thought.
And the Ark of the Covenant. Anything like that found?
Well, obviously not the Ark itself, but in Tutankhamun's tomb around 1350 BC, they found a portable wooden ark, or chest. It's the only one like it from antiquity.
That resembles the description.
There are similarities, yeah.
Yeah.
And also, in Tut's tomb, there's that small gilded shrine with a pedestal. It has footprints marked on it.
Footprints.
Yeah, suggesting an invisible presence stood there. It kind of echoes the idea of the Holy of Holies, tangible parallels from the right sort of period.
Interesting comparison. What about covenants? Treaties.
That's another big area. The covenants in Genesis, like Abraham and Abimelech, Isaac and Abimelech, Jacob and Laban, their structure matches the typical format of covenants from the early 2nd millennium BC, known from Hittite examples.
Yeah, the Mosaic Covenant. Exodus, Deuteronomy.
That structure closely matches the standard covenant treaty format from the late 2nd millennium BC, again, the time of Moses.
So the style fits the supposed time period.
Exactly. And the fact that the Mosaic ones don't invoke pagan gods as witnesses, which the Hittite treaties do, that's also what you'd expect for a covenant between God and Israel.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, what about specific places mentioned in, say, the Exodus journey, like Dibon?
Right, Dibon. Some argued it wasn't occupied between 1500 and 900 BC, so the Israelites couldn't have passed by it.
Absence of evidence.
Is not evidence of absence, exactly. Turns out, Egyptian lists from Karnak, Pharaoh Thutmose III around 1450 BC, and Ramses II around 1250 BC both mention Dibon.
So it was known then?
It certainly appears so, and Thutmose III's list of places even parallels the list in Numbers 33 quite remarkably.
Okay, moving to the conquest under Joshua. What does archaeology say there?
Well, first, remember, the Bible only says Joshua destroyed 3 cities, Jericho, Ai, and Hazor, not every Canaanite town.
Right, so Jericho.
Jericho's tricky. The dating of its destruction is debated, but Bryant Wood's analysis points to a destruction around 1400 BC, Joshua's time, maybe earthquake and fire. It fits the biblical description quite well. Ai's location isn't certain, but if it's the site called Khirbet Nisia, that also shows destruction around 1400 BC.
And Hazor. That was a big city, right?
Huge. And Hazor has multiple destruction layers. The first big one is around 1400 BC, maybe Joshua. Then another around 1300 BC, maybe Pharaoh Seti Ally. And a third around 1220 BC.
Who might have caused that third one?
Possibly related to Deborah's victory mentioned in Judges. What's really interesting at Hazor, though, is after that third destruction, the way the city was resettled shows big changes in religious practices. Things consistent with an Israelite presence taking over.
So layers of evidence building up.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's the Merneptah skull.
Ah, that was a famous one.
Yeah, around 1220 BC. Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah bragging about his campaign, and he says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more.
Gruesome boast.
But it's the earliest clear mention of Israel outside the Bible, confirms they were a known people in Canaan by that time.
And it's not the only inscription mentioning biblical stuff, is it?
Not by a long shot. We have inscriptions confirming loads of biblical kings. David, Omri, Ahab, Jehu, Hezekiah, Manasseh. The list goes on. Real people attested in the records of their neighbors.
So when you pull it all together...
What you see, really, is that archaeology has consistently challenged older assumptions about the Bible being historically unreliable. Time and again, things that critics dismissed.
Like the Hittites.
Like the Hittites, exactly. Or King Tiglath-Pileser III. People doubting they existed, then boom, archaeological proof.
Even into the New Testament period.
Yep. The Pilate inscription confirming Pontius Pilate was prefect. The discovery of a crucified man's skeleton from the 1st century. These things add tangible background.
So the digging continues to shed light.
It does, and it keeps providing this context, showing the biblical world was a real world. But, as our sources suggest, even with all this validation, the core message, the spiritual and ethical truths of the Bible, that kind of transcends whether we find a specific potsherd or inscription, doesn't it? The historical accuracy is fascinating, maybe even faith-affirming for some, but it's not the whole story.
A really important distinction. The history supports it, but the meaning goes deeper.
Precisely.
Well, that's certainly a thought-provoking place to leave it. The past is definitely not done revealing its secrets. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.